All right, well, welcome to you all. Tonight is our adult education class, and I'm filling in this evening for Rabbi Allen, who's away in Israel, and hopefully having a fabulous time over there celebrating Hanukkah. Tonight, and I'm an elder here at Arrowhead Messianic Congregation, and my area is teaching. And we, of course, teach from a Messianic perspective, and with a keen interest in the Old Testament and Torah, and how these things relate to the New Testament. Tonight we're going to be looking at the Maccabean Revolt, and in fact we're going to be looking at that not only tonight, but also on the following Tuesday, December 11th. That will be our part 2 of this class, and I think it should be really fun. I've taught on the Maccabean Revolt here for probably, I think, 4 years now. And every year is a little bit different. Every year I find new things in there that are exciting. So I'm excited about tonight's class, and hopefully everybody will enjoy it. So just to remind everybody, we do have our last night of Hanukkah, our celebration in Rosh Chodesh for the month of Tevet. That's going to be on Sunday, December 9th. At 6 p.m. we're going to meet out in the fellowship hall. So join us there. Bring your Hanukkahs. Get your Hanukkah glasses, right? Because when we light up all those Hanukkahs, it's just absolutely gorgeous with all those lights. And the Hanukkah glasses will give you little stars of David's that you can see around each of the lights, which are kind of cool. At 7 p.m., we will retire from the fellowship hall and come into the sanctuary, and we will celebrate the Rosh Chodesh for the month of Tevet. Those are always fabulous times. I encourage you to join us for those. For those of you who don't have them, there are some handouts out in the lobby that include a calendar as well as a list of various activities. Recall that this Friday we are going to be celebrating an oneg, a Hanukkah oneg. So 6 p.m. in the fellowship hall, we're going to be meeting there. Bring dishes to share with everybody. I'm going to be cooking latkes. We're going to have some fun, some fellowship, spin the dreidel a few times, and just have a great time. Of course, at 7 p.m., our regular Erev Shabbat service will start. And the sermon that evening, it's a short sermon, but it's a sermon on letting your light shine. Topic near and dear to the concept of Hanukkah. On Shabbat, we are going to have our regular Shabbat service, of course, on the 8th. And, of course, Erev Shabbat this week is on the 7th of December. On the 8th of December, I'll be giving a message entitled, It Was the Feast of Dedication. And we'll be looking at how Yeshua relates to Hanukkah. Because I think it's important for everybody to understand that this celebration of the rededication of the temple does not happen in a vacuum. And ultimately, if it is of God, it is about Yeshua. And so I want to share with you exactly how that works. We will have, of course, the Hanukkah service on the 9th, and next Tuesday, the 11th, the last of the adult education classes for part 2 of Hanukkah. So again, make sure you join us if you're available. And 6 p.m. in the fellowship hall, 7 p.m. for Rosh Chodesh. So there's some concepts that we need to look at when it comes to prophecy. And not all prophecies come across this way, but we do have a set of prophecies that are what we would call near and far prophecies. They have a near fulfillment, and then they have a distant fulfillment or a far point in time fulfillment. So as we think of these, you can kind of think, and they occur in 2 different fashions. In one of those fashions, we have some sort of vision or utterance that comes from God, prophecy that comes from God to a prophet. And there's some sort of fulfillment that occurs, but it's a partial fulfillment that occurs in some future date that's near. And then at a much later date, what we would call the distant future, there's a final fulfillment of that, and that tends to be magnified compared to what the initial partial fulfillment would be. Now, we also see this in another area, although because our terminology is so poor, we don't really recognize it as such. Okay, there is a set of prophecies that come to us that actually start off with a miracle from God. And then we have the vision or utterance of the Lord given to the prophet. And then we have a near fulfillment of that, and then a final ultimate fulfillment of it as well. Now, this latter group includes the appointments of Adonai that occur on a yearly basis. And when we talk about these things as feasts and festivals, we completely miss the fact that these are prophecies, right? There's a miracle that occurs in the case of Pesach. God passes over the Hebrews while bringing judgment to Egypt through the death of the firstborn of both man and beast, and redemption and salvation to Bnei Israel. And then, of course, there's the giving of the law. And part of that, Leviticus chapter 23, is this concept of celebrating the Pesach. And of course, it absolutely positively does look back at what occurred in Egypt and about the judgment, the mighty judgment, the redemption, the salvation, but it also looks forward to the same. And in the near term, Yeshua serves as that Paschal lamb. Of course, he also serves as the red heifer. And he is that sacrifice so that God will pass over our sin and see us as holy, as clean, and redeems us, saves us, and claims us as his own. Now, though we tend to focus on Yeshua, and we tend to think of Yeshua as being the primary thing that all of this is about, and there's no doubt about it, but he is the instrument by which all of this occurs, right? You and I await the saints that are yet to come to intimately understand Yeshua as Lord and Savior, and through the Holy Spirit and the preaching of the gospel. Once the last of the saints comes in, then we will have the ultimate fulfillment of Pesach, and that will occur also with the Aviv first fruits. So the Aviv first fruits, the miracle that God performs is the crossing of the Red Sea. And this occurs 3 nights and 3 days after the Passover. The last day that they had along the Red Sea was a full day. They rested a full day, camped along the Red Sea. Right? And then the prophecy that's given is the what we would call the Aviv first fruit barley mincha. Right? Now the mincha has to do with the covenant. The mincha and the nesek are a covenantal meal. It represents the Trinity man covenant. It has faith, it has prayer, it has Shema, which we would understand as obedience, and it's a special mincha that's only brought on this one day. It has to be taken out of the fields. The Aviv barley is brought out of the fields, had to be roasted and transformed to make groats, to make this special mincha that's required on this day. And again, this day is the day following the regular Sabbath, the regular day of rest that occurs during the week of unleavened bread. Now, the near fulfillment of that is the transformation of the physical body of Christ from dead flesh on a cold rock slab to a transformed eternal body 3 nights and 3 days after the Passover. Now, he offers himself to God, the Father, as the first fruits of many brothers to come. That's you and I. And there's a rebirth, or a birth from above, as John would term it in the Gospel in chapter 3. And that's a rebirth from above by water. Now, the distant fulfillment of this is the resurrection and the rapture of the saints, right? We have Christ, who is the first fruits of many to come, but at the final fulfillment of this, you have the resurrection and rapture of you and I and all of those that belong to Yeshua. And as we know, we are promised that we will have a transformed and eternal body. So you can see this pattern of near fulfillment and distant fulfillment, right? And again, though we don't really think of these, all of these appointments, these yearly appointments, fit this category. Again, in the case of Shavuot, you have the giving of the law at Mount Sinai 50 days after the crossing of the Red Sea. Represents the marriage covenant. God takes Israel as his bride. You and I, by faith, are grafted into Israel, so we are part of that marriage covenant. The gift of Torah, right? The other term for the menkah is a present or a gift. The prophecy part of this, given to us in Leviticus chapter 23, is the first fruits of the wheat. And this is deemed a new menkah, right? That would be a new covenant. And it's 2 indistinguishable leavened loaves of wheat that are brought from your homes, not out of the fields. And 50 days after the first fruit of Aviv barley, menkah. Now, the near fulfillment of this prophecy is 50 days after the resurrection of Yeshua. On Shavuot, he sends the Holy Spirit as a companion to bring all things to remembrance, to guide us and to encourage us. He sent to the Jews and the Gentile that they would be indistinguishably one new man. And again, this is going to be the rebirth by the Holy Spirit that's spoken of by John in chapter 3. The distant fulfillment of this is going to be the new transformed body that we have, right, which is actually the Aviv first fruits. But we also get new hearts that are transformed into hearts of flesh. And the living Torah at that point will be written upon our new hearts. This is the new covenant that is spoken of in Jeremiah 31 through chapter 31, verse 31 through 34. So we can see that we have a couple of different ways that this near and far prophecy shows up. And it's really important to recognize that this is not an evolutionary thing. The world likes to apply evolution to all kinds of things, but it doesn't apply here, right? What occurs in the near fulfillment and in the distant fulfillment are the same, right, for all practical purposes. You're getting the Holy Spirit. Now the Holy Spirit and the law are written in the hearts. It's not a progression from something that has to change and become something different than what it was. Our God is not a God of mistakes. He's not a God of disorder. He's a God of order. So what it does is actually it magnifies in each of these steps the prophecies of God. And they get larger with each one. So for those of you that like this sort of thing, I'll just throw this out there. But really what we're looking at here is something that would be self-similar. It looks the same in the near term as it looks in the far term. Our God is a God of non-linearity. This image that you're seeing is an image of a fractal. And it doesn't matter how far in you go, how much you magnify it, or how far out you get the same picture. So what I did was to take this portion here that I outlined in red, and then I cropped this down and then I blew it up. And what you see is the same picture, okay? We like to linearize things to make things a little bit easier to understand, but our God and nature actually works in a nonlinear fashion. And fractals, that self-similarity between different levels, the deeper you go, the more you see the same God. You're not going to see a different God the closer and the more magnified that you get to it. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So if anybody has questions about that, it's an interesting concept to explore, and one we weren't really aware of until the turn of last century and didn't really have the ability to look at it until we had computers. So, yes, ma'am.
Could you define fractal, please?
Yeah, a fractal is a number that's raised to a non-unit integer, or I'm sorry, non-integer number. So 1.4, 1.3, it may have a number of decimal places behind it. The reason that we can look across a field during the winter and know what kind of a tree is at the far end, even though there's no leaves on it, is because each type of tree has its own branching structure, right? And we can recognize an oak from a maple. We can recognize different types of maple just by looking at the structure of the branches. Well, that's one of those fractal sorts of occurrences within nature. In fact, once you start looking at nature, you find fractals everywhere. The branching of the respiratory tree, fractal. Different in humans than it is in pigs, than it is in horses, than it is in dogs. Each species has a slightly different number, and you use that number and you can literally generate an image of that fractal tree. That tree, same thing with the circulatory system. It's just it ends up being a really easy way to code information that's very complex. We all like computer-generated graphics. They look really impressive. They all work off of fractals. But back in the 90s, when they were trying to generate trees that looked real, or hair that looked real, or surfaces of water that looked real, they did so using code, and to generate a single tree, they ended up with close to 500,000 lines of code in order to make it look normal. With a fractal, they had 2 lines of code. And with this iterative generation of branching that they could create, they could create it with very simple amounts of information because it's encoded in the information. So does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome. A chance to throw out some physics anytime in math. So for the near and far prophecies, we're going to be looking a little bit at Daniel's and the prophecy. With Daniel, this fits closer to the first set of near-far prophecies that we talked about, where we have some sort of vision or we have some sort of pronouncement by God. In the case of Daniel, both of his all of his visions occur at night generally, although there's one that occurs during the day, but they're all visions that he has, as opposed to Moses being spoken to by God and given Leviticus chapter 23, which then has the Moedim, which turn out to also be near-far prophecies. So the partial fulfillment of some of these are in Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Okay, and we'll look at how that is. And before we had progressed through time far enough to have Christ come onto the earth, to have him go through his ministry, to die for our sins on the cross, and then be resurrected, and then eventually ascend to heaven, and then to give the Holy Spirit. Before we had that, there was some thoughts that maybe Antiochus was not the partial fulfillment, but the full fulfillment of the prophecy. But we know that that's not the case because we have Yeshua himself speaking to this in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 22. So if we look at that, they read, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down to take what is in the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." So Yeshua himself is speaking to this, and he points out that this desolating sacrilege that stands in the holy place, that we recognize as Antiochus Epiphanes in the near prophecy, here we have a clear indication that there's something that's going to come that is going to make what Antiochus Epiphanes did look like almost nothing. It will be dramatically worse. So again, a magnification effect of the prophecy in the distant time frame versus the near time frame. So real quickly, as an overview of Daniel, the book of Daniel is fabulous. The book, when we talk to people who are scholars, the modern scholars do not believe that the book of Daniel was written during the time frame of Daniel. They don't believe that it actually is prophecy at all. What they believe is that the book of Daniel was written after all of these prophecies that are listed in there are fulfilled, and then it was written after the fact using the facts in order to create this pseudo-prophecy that supposedly had been given. We're going to look at something this evening that I would point out refutes that. But as an overview of the book of Daniel, you have chapters 1 to 6, which detail the life and times of Daniel. Remember, Daniel was a child in Jerusalem at the time that Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes the city. Now, the people are all removed out of there. They are taken to Babylon. Many of them are trained. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That story and the story of them being unwilling to bow a knee to this statue, to this idol, because of their God that they have made a commitment to, actually mirrors what we see later on in the Maccabean revolt. But the life and times of Daniel are kind of given as an overview in chapters 1 to 6. Chapters 7 to 12, though, convey 4 visions that were given to Daniel. Chapter 7, the vision given to Daniel, is a broad overview of end-time events. Chapter 8 is fairly specific, or very specific, and it talks about the time from the Medo-Persian Empire to Antiochus Epiphanes IV, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Chapter 9, Gabriel the angel explains the 70 weeks that are spoken of. In chapter 10, there's a vision of Yeshua. And in chapter 11, there's a very detailed prophecy of the history from Babylon through to Antiochus Epiphanes. In chapter 12, the final chapter of Daniel, the book of Daniel, is one that talks about the time of trouble that is to come. So real quickly, just to get everybody oriented, and certainly a multi-week study of the book of Daniel, or in my case, a multi-month study of the book of Daniel, would be very easy to undertake. But again, this chapter 7 of the prophecies is going to be a broad overview of the end times to come. It has this wonderful imagery of these 4 great beasts. And we're told by the angel that the 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. They look very different than the prophecies that we will see in chapter 8. And it's important to note that verse 23 of this says, "As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down and break it into pieces." And there are lots and lots of folks who try to figure out exactly who each of these 4 fantastical beasts refer to. It is, we've had prophecies of everything from Rome, the Holy Roman Church, to New York City. But I would just tell you that it's interesting, and it raises my eyebrow that in verse 23 it talks about this 4th beast that arises shall be a 4th kingdom, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth. So it can't be like the other kingdoms, because it's different from all the other kingdoms. And what that means, time will tell. And that is the subject of another class. So chapter 8 begins this prophecy that is a little different. Now, the last one happened with Daniel in bed, and he's in bed and he has this vision, and there is an angel there to explain it to him. here, he, in his vision, though he is elsewhere, he sees himself standing at the banks of the Yuli Canal at the Susa Citadel. So he's off in another part of the Babylonian kingdom. And there's this ram and goat that he sees. Okay, and this chapter gives us a detailed description, and as does chapter 11. And chapter 11 is even more detailed description of the time from Alexander the Great to Antiochus Epiphanes. So let's look at these. So the Medes and the Persians, we're told specifically in the book of Daniel, it says, starting at verse 3, I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had two horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. So the Persian Empire is the first to arise up, and the Medes arise later and take on even more power. And they are able to extend the borders of their control as far as Egypt and Libya. They are looking to get into Macedonia and Thrace, and this is way before Alexander the Great. And they extend all the way over into the area of India and the Indus River. Now verse 5 continues and says, as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes, and it's just one horn. It came towards the ram with the two horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. And I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its two horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Now, this is speaking of Alexander the Great, who would be the Greek that is spoken of that comes out of the west. And he is going to attack the empire of the Persians and the Medes. Now, before he began his conquest of Asia, he was home in this area of Dion, Macedonia. That's this area up in here. And while he was there, he had a vision. Now, he had been thinking about what it was that he needed to do in order to be able to maybe take the Persian and the Mede Empire. And in this vision, he sees a man who exhorts him to make no delay, but to boldly pass over the sea to him, and that he would conduct Alexander the Great and his army and would give them dominion over the Persians. Now, he starts undertaking this based upon that vision, and he goes to war against one of the generals of the Medes and the Persians, and he battles him at Issus. Issus is right here, and he defeats him there. Now, they were outnumbered 6-1. But even though they were outnumbered, they were able to defeat them. And I'm sorry, that's Darius III that he's going up against. Now, at this point, having been defeated, Darius III actually offers peace. And he offers to him half of all of his kingdom that stretched from the borders of Macedonia to the Euphrates River. But Alexander refuses this. So he moves to secure the seaports that are along the Mediterranean Sea. Tyre is renowned for its security, and it's an island that's completely surrounded by city walls that have, or seawalls that have city walls on top of them, and they're so high that it was thought to be impregnable and that nobody would be able to conquer it. So he's going to move from the area of Issus, and he's going to come down. He actually moves in and takes Damascus and then goes on to Tyre. And he's securing this area. He's basically got to secure this area because if there's going to be any help that comes for the Medes and the Persian, it's going to come via the sea. So he's trying to cut off anything that they may be able to do. Now, we're going to talk about another group too. There's a group that exists at this time called the Cuthians, and they are and will become the Samaritans. And we're going to look at the problems that the Samaritans and the people of Judah have. And we're going to look at that because it ends up becoming very important to what's going to occur here. Some of these backstories are probably as important as some of the others. But remember, the Samaritans and the Jews really hated each other. And we're going to find out why that is here this evening. The Jews literally would walk way out of their way to avoid going through their territory in order to reach the Sea of Galilee. They would take a much more hazardous journey just so that they didn't have to walk through the area of the Samaritans. So remember that when the temple starts getting rebuilt and when Cyrus releases the Jews from Babylon to return back and to rebuild the walls and to rebuild the temple, the Samaritans, along with some of the other people local to the area, rise up to try to put an end to this, right? And so again, they're going to stand against the Jews. So the Samaritans, as it turns out, were derived from a mixture of Assyrians that were sent in to settle the land of the northern kingdom of Israel when the northern kingdom of Israel was taken captive. They had restarted worship. There were some people that were left in that area, but they were all peasants. All of the people from the cities, all the people from the lines of the kings and the princes, all of those people were either killed or removed off, and most of those people we never hear from again. But they send folks back in, and they decide that they want to restart worshiping Adonai. But they were struggling to implement their worship. Now, remember, these are the peasants. These aren't the priests, so they don't really know how to do these things, but they know that they should. And they petition and receive approval from Babylon, and Babylon sends to them a low-level Levite priest to help oversee their victory. But it was a low-level priest that had been molded to what the Babylonians would like. And unfortunately, along with his help, he also brings with him and implements a synergistic way of worshiping God, a way that's different than what the Jews do. Right? Here's one of the primary reasons that the Jews and the Samaritans don't like each other, because the Jews say, well, it has to be done a certain way at a certain place. That's Jerusalem. And the Samaritans are like, no, Mount Gerizim. That's where we're doing it, and we do it in this way, and it's different than what the Jews were doing. So you don't find a whole lot of explanation for how it is that this Levite priest could bring synergistically the worships that were being practiced in Babylon and mesh them with a monotheistic worship of Adonai. We always think of these pagans as being polytheistic, as having lots of gods, but it turns out that the prevalent god at the time was Zoroastrianism, and that religion was monotheistic. And so it would be much easier to mesh the practices of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism actually persists up until Islam basically eliminates it. There are still some folks that practice it today, but not very many. But that would be one way that these two things could have been synergistically combined, right? Of course, God tells us not to do that. So part of the great animosity, again, between the Jews and the Samaritan is due to this running feud over the practices of worship, the place of worship, and the view that by the Jews that the synergistic worship practices, and I would say also the view by God, that mixing people without conversion to Judaism is wrong, but so is mixing worship practices. God says, do not worship me as the pagans do, and there's a reason for that. The Samaritans, of course, felt that they were in the right place and doing the right things. Now, at the time of Alexander the Great, there are some notable events that are occurring between the Samaritans and the Jews. So we have Jerusalem there with the Star of David in this area. This is the kingdom of Judea below. The northern kingdom is going to be the area that eventually becomes, part of this becomes the Samaritan area. That Star of David that is superimposed over a lion, that's not the Lion of Judah. That's the Lion of Babylon, because again, they were synergistically combining these things. The location that they were seated at, the seat of power for the Samaritans, was Shechem. Shechem sits in the bowl that's formed by Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, right? Place where Jacob had come, the place where Joshua calls together all of Israel, not once, not twice, but 3 times in order to speak to them there. And they want to worship there rather than in Jerusalem. So at about this time, there's a high official that's sent by Darius into Samaria. And he's from this area. He's a Cuthian by birth, a man by the name of Sanballat. And he views the Jews in Jerusalem as trouble for the Medo-Persian Empire due to the history that they've had. They've rebelled many times. And he decides that to strengthen the ties between the Jews and the Medo-Persians, he could do so by marriage and hopefully make his rule of that area much easier. Now, he marries his daughter to the brother of the high priest. The brother's name is Manasseh. And the elders, of course, were vehemently opposed to this because now, again, we're mixing people who are not Jews in with not only Jews, but the Levite line and somebody who is literally the brother to the high priest. Of course, the high priest is under the most stringent marriage requirements. But so is the line of Levi. So the brother sides with the elders, and his name is Jaddua. And he is high priest, and again, it's his brother Manasseh that's doing this violation. So now Manasseh's been confronted, and he either has to divorce this woman that he loves, or to give up his ability to worship at the temple, because they're not going to allow him to worship God and violate the covenant that he is supposed to be keeping. So he goes to his father-in-law, Sanballat, and he says, okay, look, I love your daughter, but I've got to divorce her because they are causing me to be turned out from the temple, and I can't worship God there anymore. And Sanballat counters this with an offer, and he says, look, I'll set it up so that you can continue being a priest of God, and not only that, but I'll make you high priest, right? And not only will I make you high priest, but he's getting up there in age, Sanballat is, and he says, I will turn over to you the position of governor that I have so that you will reign over all this territory. And he puts it contingent on Manasseh staying married to his daughter. Well, Manasseh says that's pretty good. As a further pledge, he says, we will build a temple like the one in Jerusalem on top of Mount Gerizim. And that's where they worshiped already. They already had a smaller temple structure, but he was talking about taking the resources of the Medo-Persian Empire and creating a temple similar to what they had in Jerusalem, on the same scale, the same sorts of gold and silver vessels and all of those things. So Manasseh says, okay, that sounds pretty good. I think we'll do that. And many of the people of Jerusalem actually side with Manasseh and now Sanballat starts plying them with money and with land that they can then grow stuff on in order to destabilize things further and to try to undermine the high priest and those that are trying to keep the ways of God. Now Darius III moves with a large army to attack Alexander the Great. And when he comes back this second time, the numbers are not just 6 to 1, they're like 13 or 14 to 1. And everybody's like, oh, now we got them. Those numbers are so high that they don't even think that Alexander the Great's going to show up to the battle. That they just don't think it's going to happen because, he's so greatly outnumbered, and they've got battle elephants. They've got a whole bunch of battle elephants. Alexander doesn't have those. So, of course, Alexander the Great does show up. He defeats Darius III there, and he takes Darius's mother, his wife, and his children hostage as Darius flees back to Persia. At this point, he moves down, takes Damascus, he takes Sidon, and then he lays siege at Tyre. So he's going to lay siege there. Now, Tyre is a town that is in two parts. The predomination of it was on an island, and that island had a very high seawall, and then on top of the seawall it had a huge wall, and it was deemed to be impregnable. It was deemed that nobody could conquer it. And it was separated from the land by this 700 to 800 meters of water. So if you were going to try to take Tyre, you had to do so by sea. And this was why they thought that nobody would ever be able to take it. Alexander the Great, though, comes up with a very novel way of dealing with this. He builds a seawall, or actually a dam, or not really a dam, it's more of a, I'm trying to think of what they call those things, a jetty that sticks out from the mainland, goes all the way up to the wall, and they keep building it higher and higher and higher until they can breach the wall and get in, and they actually take the city of Tyre. He kills half the population, and he only spares those that had sought refuge in the Tyre temple. But those, though he spares their lives, and there's about 30,000 of them, he sells them into slavery. Well, while he is in the process of laying siege to Tyre, he sends word down to the Mediterranean ports below him. And this is what Tyre looks like today. This is that northern marina type area, and there was a southern one that the island extended down this part, but the years have taken part of it. But they kept building that and widening that, and now there's actually people who live on this side of the berm, and it extends all the way out to the island. So while he's at Tyre up here, again, we have Shechem here, we got Jerusalem there, we've got a number of other ports that can be used, and he sends word down to those ports and he says, hey, I'm coming. You either join me and give me what you would have been giving to Darius, and I'll spare your cities, or when I get there, I'm going to do to you what I'm going to do to Tyre, and what I've done in the other places where he's really killed much of the population. Well, everybody capitulates except for Gaza. Well, Gaza was held by a commander that's loyal to Darius, and they had already planned, after losing that last battle with Alexander the Great, that the retaking of this area of Syria would be undertaken through Gaza. And so the plan always has been to use Gaza and Tyre. Now Tyre's not going to be available, but to use Gaza then to move in and to take the rest of the area. So that's the only one that doesn't. Now, while he's there, he sends a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem. And he says, okay, Give to me what you have promised to Darius the third, and choose friendship with the Macedonians, and never repent of doing so. Now the high priest, the same Jedua, the brother to Manasseh, sends word back through the messengers that he has made an oath to Darius the third. Remember, Yeshua says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Don't go back on those things. And he says, I cannot go against this oath I've made to Darius as long as Darius is living. Well, Alexander the Great is furious, to say the least. He threatens to bring an expedition to Jerusalem, and his plan is to teach all men through the cruelty that he's going to bring to bear on Jerusalem, to whom they should make and keep an oath. So his intent is to just utterly destroy Jerusalem. Well, of course, Sanballat sees an opportunity. He hasn't received any message from Alexander the Great, but he renounces Darius III. He proceeds to conscript an army of 7,000 men and shows up unannounced at Tyre to pitch in with Alexander the Great, and he hands off his conscripts to him to use however Alexander wants to use them. Now, Alexander's pleased with this, and Sanballat approaches Alexander the Great with the issue that he has for his son-in-law, Manasseh. And he tells Alexander that many people of Judah have sided with Manasseh, and that they want a temple at Mount Gerizim, and that it would be advantageous to divide the Jews and the Samaritans, and thereby weaken the Jews so that the Jews can't rise up against them. Alexander goes ahead and gives Sanballat leave to build a temple there in Mount Gerizim, which he does fairly quickly, and he installs Manasseh there as high priest. This is where the second priesthood is coming from. Okay. Now, after 7 months of siege, it takes them 7 months to build the berm, to get in and take Tyre, and then they head south and they go down to Gaza. It only takes them 2 months to take Gaza. And at that point, Sanballat dies. Okay. Now, Alexander has not forgotten about Jerusalem, and once he has secured Gaza, he turns to Jerusalem with every intent to do violence there due to the choice of the high priest of Judah. So, everybody knows what's coming next. In Gaza, they spared less people in Gaza than what they did in Tyre. They killed half the city outright. And he's already said publicly that his intent is to basically make sure that everybody understands and thinks of Jerusalem before they ever think of going back, not entering into a agreement with him or going back on an agreement with him. Well, the people of Jerusalem and the high priest himself, they're all terrified, and rightly so. And the priest asked the people to make supplications and to make sacrifices unto God, and after the high priest offers his, that night God speaks to him in a dream. And he tells him, take courage, adorn the city, make it look beautiful, and open all the gates. And dress the people in white, and the priests should wear their priestly attire, and he should wear his high priest outfit. And when Alexander the Great comes, he's to go out the city, leaving all the gates open, and go meet him. Which you gotta believe. Do you shema or do you not shema? That's the question. That's a tough one. Well, they get word that Alexander the Great is within a very short distance of the city. They can see the army, and they do just that. They dress the people in all white. They go out with the priests in their attire, and the high priest is leading the way. And Alexander the Great, as always, was out at the front of his army. He had already given permission to his troops to sack everything, to kill anybody and everybody, and to take all the possessions. The plan was to just make Jerusalem a bloodbath. Again, he had revenge, and vengeance that he wanted to reap upon Jerusalem. But as they're traveling, they see the high priest with the priests behind him and the people behind them, and they see the city adorned and the gates open, and they get to within a short distance of the high priest, and Alexander the Great says, "Hold up, stay here." And he gets off of his horse and he walks over to the high priest and bows down to the high priest. Wow, think of that. Yeah, just amazing. He greets him, and he greets him in the name of the God that is on the mitre across the high priest's forehead. And the high priest greets him back, and the priest and everybody is praising Alexander and saying, how wonderful it is that he's here, right? And one of his soldiers, one of his trusted generals, approaches him, and in a quiet moment asks him, "What's going on?" "Well, we were ready to come through and basically take everything they got and kill everybody, take slaves, do whatever we pleased." And he says, "When I was in Dion, in a vision, I saw this man, and he came and told me that I should come to conquer the Medes and the Persians." Wow, right? So, my comment would be that, well, let me finish up the story a little bit. So, they go into Jerusalem. The high priest is basically showing them around. They bring him into the temple, and they open the scroll of Daniel for him and read the scroll of Daniel for him and say, "This is you, this single-horned goat. This is you." And of course, there's no question about that, because the interpretation that is given in the scroll is not just talking about animals, but it says the Medes and the Persians. It talks about the Macedonian who comes and is going to conquer the world. And so he understands that God has had a hand in this and that God is orchestrating these things for him. So all of these things are well documented, right? And if that scroll of Daniel had not existed at that time, as the scholars would tell you today that it does not, that it was written all after the fact, and not just after that day, but after Antiochus IV and further down, all right? That's their explanation for why it's all correct. Well, because they don't believe that there is a God. But we have the high priest showing the scroll to Daniel, and I'm sorry, to Alexander the Great, and saying, "Our God foretold this, and you are that man, and you will conquer them," which is exactly what Alexander had been told when he was back home in Macedonia. So for those of you who think maybe there are no one-horned goats, there are. This is a type of goat that is specific to the higher elevations of the Pyrenees in Spain. So continuing with Daniel, then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, anybody know what kind of sheep this is? No. They're local to Arizona. This is a Navajo sheep, and they naturally have 4 horns. Very, very cool, huh? So we think these things are not things that actually occur, but they do. So when Alexander the Great dies, and he dies in the far eastern part of the areas that he's conquested, he places his 4 generals that he has trusted in command. So there's Cassandra, there's Lysimachus, there's Ptolemy, and there's Seleucus. Verse 9 continues, out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, and towards the east, and towards the beautiful land. That would be towards Judea. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to earth some of the host and some of the stars, and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of his wickedness, the host was given over to it. And that's because of the wickedness of the host. Together with the regular burnt offerings, it cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgressions that make desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled? And he answered him, for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So that horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's the guy with whom Judea is going to go to war with the Maccabean revolt. He was born in 215 to King Antiochus III the Great and his wife Laodice III. His name at birth was Mithridates, meaning gift of the god Mithra, a very common name at that time frame. He was named after the father of Laodice III, King Mithridates II of Pontus. He assumed the name of Antiochus, which means stubborn or resistant, when he ascended the throne in 175 BC. And he has a brother who was older than he, that is Seleucus IV Philopator. So let's look real quickly at what's going on, because we've seen this run-in between the Macedonians, the Greeks, and the Persian and the Medes, the destruction of the Persian and Mede Empire. We've got these four empires that are created. And it's important to recognize that at this time, Rome is a rising city-state, and they're exerting power more and more. They have a lot to do with the shipping channels, and they and the Parthians, which are across in Africa, North Africa, are the two that are vying for power to control these areas. And at this same time, you have Ptolemy IV in Egypt. And Egypt at this time is basically the breadbasket for the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. You can imagine that you can only raise armies, you can only make things, you can only do great works if there's enough food to not only feed the people who are raising the food. So people can't be just living by subsistence. They have to be raising enough food to have enough surplus to supply armies and to supply for metals and things of that nature that can be bartered or traded or bought and sold. So Egypt is the breadbasket to the rest of the world at this point, the rest of that part of the world at least. You have Antiochus III, who is known as Antiochus the Great. As big as Alexander the Great's empire was, the Seleucid part of that had really shrunk down quite a bit. Now, Antiochus III is known as the Great because he reestablishes the boundaries back to what they had been during the time frame of Alexander the Great. Now, he still has the other territories that are covered by these other kings. And everybody wants to be like Alexander the Great, right? They want to be able to do what he did. So they want to rule not only what they've been given, but they want to rule what everybody else has too. And so there's lots of fighting. Really, Cassander and Lysimachus really don't have the means or the abilities to really be able to pitch these battles. And so you end up with this battle between the king of the north, Antiochus III, and the king of the south, as we're told about in Daniel, which is the Ptolemies. And it's there that a lot of the work is done to try to control these areas, because if you control those two, you can take the rest. You have the resources and metals and food and everything else that you need in order to be able to take anything and everything else you need. So Antiochus III has several children. Seleucid IV, Philopator is his oldest child. Antiochus IV, of course, he's named Mithridates at that time. And he has a daughter by the name of Cleopatra. She's Cleopatra I. She was known as the Syrian. This is not the Cleopatra of Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. That'll come later in a different Cleopatra. So what he does is he starts warring against the Ptolemies, and he's able to take Judea, and he's able to take the area of Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula up to the parts of Egypt that actually are going to be useful, right? Sinai Peninsula is mostly sand, tough area to cross. It's a natural barrier. And Ptolemy elicits help from the Romans. The Romans their forte, starting now and going forward, is to make agreements to come to people's aids in order to get their foot in the door, and thereby they will eventually take over those areas that they make agreements with. And they do this time and time and time again. Egypt will be no different than that. So with the Romans there to be able to counter, and they physically weren't there, but the promise was that the Romans would send their troops. Antiochus III decides that what he would do is to try to conquer the remaining two to the west, because if he can conquer all of these territories and he controls everything, then he can turn his attention here and conquer all the way over there. And the lines of travel are going to be so long for the Romans because they can't come through these other directions that it's just going to be too hard for them. So he's trying to conquer territory to conquer the world. So he sets about to go into the area of Lysimachus, and he does that. But first, Ptolemy IV dies, and his son, Ptolemy V, is installed as the emperor of Egypt. Now, Antiochus says, great opportunity. We've got a young king down there. He's about 16, 17. I've got a daughter. She's young too, but you know what? She grew up in my household, and I think she can rule the roost over Ptolemy V, and we're going to send her over to marry into the family, and now I'll be able to control those areas, maybe not outright, but pretty close, and eventually she can control them. That was the plan, at least. Cleopatra had different ideas. She says, yeah, it's kind of good over here. I like it over here. I think we can be a world power. I said, no, Dad, I don't think I'm going to follow that game plan. And she aligns herself also with the Romans. So he pushes into the territories of Lysimachus and is making great strides. He's pressing into the peninsula that is Macedonia and Greece down below. And now the Romans are brought into play in this, and they send over just a few of their legions. And if the Romans are going to side with Cassander, then of course the Carthaginians, who hate the Romans and are looking to control the shipping lanes, they're going to side with the Seleucids. And so the Romans move to kind of keep anything from occurring. The Carthaginians move to support the Seleucids, and that the expectation is that now with the combined army of the Carthaginians and Antiochus, that the Romans, who are greatly outnumbered and have no battle elephants, are going to get wiped out. Now, when Antiochus the Great retook the areas to the very east, in these areas, he went from having 50 battle elephants to 150 battle elephants. Okay, not a trivial thing during that time frame. And nobody in the rest of the world has them. So very great opportunity for him. It doesn't go the way that he thinks. At the Battle of Thermopylae at 191, they get their hats handed to them, and they get pushed back into the area of the mainland. And then in the Battle of Magnesia, in 190, they get beaten again. And they get beaten so handedly that the Carthaginians, Hannibal of Carthage, is going to disappear, and the Carthaginians themselves are no longer going to be able to mount an ability to do much of anything, and they get taken over by Rome and fade from history. Now, at this point, there's a peace treaty that ensues, and they finally agree in 188, the Treaty of Apamea. And at this point, Antiochus is going to have to send one of his sons to be held hostage in Rome. Mithridates, the youngest son, is sent to Rome. He's raised by the Romans. He's trained by the Romans, as they always did. The Seleucid Empire was now going to have to pay a yearly indemnity, a yearly fee to the Romans, and it was huge. He had great trouble raising it, so much so that he began raiding the temples, the religious temples, in order to try to come up with the gold and silver that was required to pay this. And in the process of that, when he goes to Susa, he raids the temple there, and though successful, they gain the wealth of the temple, but he gets injured and he dies in Susa. So that, of course, brings a set of circumstances where Antiochus disappears, he's dead, his son Seleucid IV rises to power, and now Antiochus, Mithridates, who's with the Romans, is absolutely no use to them. Right? So they send him back and demand that Seleucid IV send one of his sons, which he does. So as we look at this time frame, there's something else I want you to see. As we look at the timeline with this, of course you can see Alexander the Great, he's died. Ptolemy II, we didn't talk about him, but he was a great ruler of Egypt. He ruled Judea as well. And part of the work that had begun under Alexander, the library at Alexandria, the city that was formed there, they would take all the books that they could find, all the logs, they would transcribe them, and copies would be given back to the people who had brought them. And the library at Alexandria would hang on to the originals. Well, they go to the Jews, and they ask the Jews to bring over the priests and the scribes so that they can translate the Hebrew, the Torah, and eventually the Tanakh into Greek. And it's from there that we get the Septuagint Bible. There's 70 of these guys who come over, and they all make a single copy of Torah, of the Pentateuch, and legend tells us all 70 of these copies, even though these guys worked separately, they all were identical when they got done. Thus the name Septuagint. So you have Antiochus III, who comes into play. He dies. Seleucid IV rules and reigns from 187 to 175 BC. And it's during this time frame, Antiochus III had been a good friend to the Jews. Alexander had been a good friend to the Jews. To go back to that story with the people of Samaria, when Alexander goes to Jerusalem and he meets the high priest and he spends time there, and the high priest gives him provisions, he gives him other troops that they now end up being the bodyguards of Alexander the Great. Again, because both of them had this vision, separate visions, but pointing at the same thing from God. And so Alexander the Great understood exactly where and from whom he was being sent, and it was by God Almighty. And so he leaves from there and he travels through Shechem on his way north, heading back up to go take the rest of the Seleucid Empire, or the Medes and the Persian Empire. And when he gets there, of course, Manasseh comes out and says, "Oh, we're so glad to see you, and we're glad that you're doing so well, and just want to confirm that we're going to implement exactly what we talked about with furnishing the temple with gold and silver, and letting us to worship in the ways that we think is appropriate." And Alexander basically just said, "Yeah, you know what? I'm going to go do what I'm going to go do, and when I come back through here, we'll talk about it then, and I'll give you a decision as to what we're going to do at that time." Completely just blew him off. But of course, Alexander the Great dies, right? He never comes back through Shechem. He never sets a different agenda, so the Samaritans are free to continue to worship in the way that they were worshiping. They didn't get the gold and silver that they were hoping to. But again, this animosity that has arisen between the Jews and the Samaritans, we have some additional problems that start developing. So Alexander's a great friend of the Jews. He basically says, you know what, every seventh year you have no taxes to pay. You have taxes to pay in other years, but we're going to let you worship however you want. That was not how he did it in the other places. They were Hellenizing as they went. They were converting these cities to cities that were cities of the Greeks, and they were setting up specific cities in which, if you were a member of that city, you were not only just a member of that city, but you were also a member of the empire, right? So these specific cities were cities in which you would be a citizen, not just a person who was part of the land, but somebody who had rights that other people don't have, right? Jerusalem is not one of those, right? Because he has left them, because you have to basically go under the rule of Alexander the Great and under the Macedonians, and he leaves them to do their own thing. So Antiochus III continues to be a good friend to the Jews, but of course he dies because he's got this tax that he's got to pay to the Romans. His son is under difficulties, and initially his son is a good friend of the Jews, but he too has got to come up with the money to pay the Romans, right? Or the Romans are going to come take territory. So he's looking to places, and we get into a story that I think it's about 10 after. I think let's take a break at this point, and we'll come in and talk about this story of Onias III, the high priest, a very, very righteous man, and the subterfuge that occurs here, where all of a sudden the Hellenization process that Jerusalem has been somewhat free of starts really ramping up, and the implications of that are going to lead to many of the issues that we have during Antiochus IV's reign. Okay, so we'll take a break for about 5 minutes, so everybody can get up, move around, get a drink of water, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. All righty. So we're going to pick up with class again. We'll have some time for some questions at the end. And so we're talking about this time frame during Seleucid IV's Philopator, the older brother to Antiochus Epiphanes. And it's during this time frame, because of the pressures that he's under with the Romans, that he has to come up with this tax that he pays to the Romans. And he's struggling just like his dad was struggling. So, though he had always been a friend to the Jews, he ends up not being so much of one. So there is a priest by the name of Onias III. He's the son of Simon II. He has succeeded his father to become high priest. Of course, that line passes from father to son. He was known for his goodliness and zeal for the law. His love of the Lord, his zeal for keeping the people in the ways of God resulted in God's blessings and favor upon Israel. He was known and greatly admired by the Gentiles and the Jews alike. King Seleucid IV Philopator, as his father before him, had defrayed the costs of service of sacrifice and supported the temple. Though greatly loved by the people, there are always folks around that have ambition and that find power to be irresistible. And in the turmoil created by the weakened Seleucid Empire amongst the Jews, there were several of these folks. The first of these is a guy by the name of Simon. Now, this is not Simon the father to Onias. This is a guy who was head of the temple, and this comes out of 2 Maccabees chapter 3. Simon was an important official in the administration of the temple, and he demanded from Onias the post of market commissioner, which Onias refused because by virtue of holding that position, he would have control over such things as the market itself, the price of goods, and employment. In effect, he would exercise all real authority within the city of Jerusalem. When his demand was rejected, Simon turned to Apollonius, who was the commander of the Syrian army, and told him that vast treasures belonging to the king, because remember, everything belonged to the king, even if you were in possession of it. If they walked into your house and you had whatever you had, it was the king's and he could take it. So Simeon tells Apollonius that the commander, and he's the commander of the Syrian army, that there's vast treasures in the temple vaults. And of course, Apollonius informs Seleucid, who then sends his chancellor, Heliodorus, to remove the treasure. Now, Heliodorus is thought to be a character that was completely made up. And as we'll see once again, history proves out that, in fact, there was a Heliodorus, and much of the rest of what is written about him is true, so we would expect the rest of this would be true as well. Now, Simon's lie would forever change the relationship of Onias to Seleucid IV, and thereafter Onias was hated by the Seleucid ruler, who really suspected him that he was withholding monies and treasure that the king should be able to do with as he pleased. But it was not Onias that prevented Heliodorus from completing his mission to confiscate the treasury of the temple. It would be God. So the book of 2 Maccabees chapter 3 tells us what happens. Starting at verse 7, when Apollonius met with the king, he told him about the money, and the king ordered Heliodorus, the chief minister, to get it for him. Heliodorus set out at once on his mission, but he claimed that he was only making a tour of inspection of the cities of Greater Syria. After he had arrived in Jerusalem and had been warmly received by the high priest, he explained the real reason for his visit and asked if what he had been told was actually true. The high priest then stated that Simon, that devil of a man, had not been telling the truth. There was indeed some money in the temple treasury, but part of it was set aside for the widows and orphans, and part of it belonged to Hyrcanthus, son of Tobias, of Tobit, of the book of Tobit fame. A very important man. He also pointed out that the total amount was only about 30,000 pounds of silver and 15,000 pounds of gold. He added that it was absolutely impossible that anyone should be permitted to take the monies of those people who had placed their trust in the sanctity and the safety of this world-famous temple. Well, Heliodorus doesn't see it that way. He insists that the money should be taken for the royal treasury as the king had ordered. So he sets a day, and on that day he went into the temple to supervise the counting of the money. And this caused an uproar throughout the entire city. Now priests wearing their priestly robes threw themselves face downward before the altar and begged God to keep the money safe, since he had given the laws designed to protect the money that the people deposited in the temple. It was heartbreaking to see the high priest, his face turned pale, revealing the agony of his soul, and his body trembling with fear, reflecting the pain in his heart. And people ran from their houses to join together in prayer that the temple might not be defiled. Women wearing nothing but skirts of sackcloth crowded the streets. Young girls whose parents had never allowed them to be seen in public ran to the gates or to the walls of the city or just stared out their windows. But wherever they went, they lifted up their hands to God in prayer. What a pitiful sight it was to see the high priest in such great agony and frustration, to see everyone in the city confused and lying face down on the ground. Now, while everyone was begging the Lord Almighty to protect the money that had been entrusted to his care, Heliodorus went on with his plan. But at that very moment, he and his bodyguards arrived at the treasury. The Lord of all supernatural powers caused such a vision to appear that everyone who had dared to enter with Heliodorus was panic-stricken and weak with fear at this display of the Lord's power. In the vision, they saw a horse and a rider, and the horse had a richly decorated bridle, and its rider dressed in gold armor, and he was frightening. Suddenly, the horse rushed at Heliodorus, then reared up and struck at him with its hooves. Heliodorus also saw two unusually strong and handsome young men wearing very fine clothes. They stood on either side of him and beat him unmercifully. He immediately fell to the ground unconscious, and his men put him on a stretcher and carried him out. Only a moment earlier, this man had entered the treasury with a large group of men, including all of his bodyguards, but now he was being carried away helpless. So they all openly acknowledged the might and power of God. Well, Heliodorus lay there unable to speak and without hope of recovery from this demonstration of God's power. But the Jews praised Almighty God because he had miraculously protected his temple and had brought great happiness where only minutes before there had been fear and confusion. Some of Heliodorus' friends quickly asked Ananias the high priest to pray that the Most High would spare the life of this man who was at this point near death. So the high priest offered a sacrifice in the hope that God would save Heliodorus, for what he did not want was the king to think that the Jews had done this to the man that he had sent. While Ananias was offering the sacrifice, the two young men wearing the same clothes as before again appeared to Heliodorus and said, "Be grateful to the high priest. The Lord has spared your life because of him. Remember that it was the Lord of heaven who punished you. Now go and tell everyone of his great power." When they had said this, they disappeared. So Heliodorus offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made many promises because the Lord had spared his life. Then he said goodbye to Ananias and returned with his army to the king. There he told everyone what the Lord, the most powerful of all gods, had done. When the king asked Heliodorus who would be the best man to send on the next mission to Jerusalem, Heliodorus replied, "If you have an enemy or know of somebody who's plotting against your government, send him. He will come back badly beaten if he comes back at all, for some strange power from God is at work there. The God of heaven watches over the temple, and he strikes down and destroys anyone who comes to harm it." This is the story of how the temple treasury was protected from Heliodorus. So for many, many years, Heliodorus was thought to be a myth that was made up by the Jews. But then they found what is known as the Heliodorus stele, which is a monument that has writing in it in multiple languages, and it includes Heliodorus within that. The painting is by Raphael in 1511 to 1512. Heliodorus. It's in the Heliodorus room at the Vatican. And the Holy Roman Church uses this story to prove that everything given to the church is now set apart for God and should thereafter remain the property of the church. Of course, the contents of the treasury were monies entrusted to the temple for the care of orphans and widows, as well as a large sum that was being held in trust for Hyrcanthus, son of Tobias. The apocryphal and deuterocanonical books of Tobit, also known as the Book of Tobias, also speaks of this arrangement with the temple to provide safekeeping for the monies of Tobias. So the Heliodorus stele, a Greek language inscription of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, it dates to 178 BC. In this stele, Seleucus informs Heliodorus that he appoints a certain Olympiodorus in charge of the temples of the Syria and Phoenicia. So, Heliodorus, though deeply convicted of his transgressions, and who openly spoke about the power of the God of Israel, was not really converted to any piousness. He successfully assassinates King Seleucid IV, though he too gets killed off. And the young child of King Seleucid IV was placed into power, and his uncle, Mithridates, kindly steps in to help out with these things. And of course, Mithridates, who is going to rename himself Antiochus IV Epiphanes, kills off the son and consolidates power. And the name Epiphanes means God manifest. The Jews, of course, never missing an opportunity for a pun, would come to call him Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus the Mad. All right, so it's 8:30. I think we'll cut it there, and we'll pick up next week and get into the details of not only the history of the revolt that's going to be led, why it occurs, the terribleness with which Antiochus IV is going to rule Judea, and the horrible things that he does, the Hellenization process that has already begun in Judea and is going to really reach a fever pitch. Most of these people who were converting out of Judaism were doing so with a gusto, right? And you end up with these two groups. You have those that want to do the things of God, and you have these others that just absolutely hate their guts for it. And they want to stamp out the people of God, even though they themselves are Jews as well. So we'll pick up with that at that point. Does anybody have any questions over the things that we talked about tonight? The book of the Maccabees, real quickly, I talked about this a few minutes ago in the break time frame. There's 4 books and a fifth that we know from antiquities existed at some point, but nobody knows exactly what was in it. It was talked about, but we don't know what was there, so we don't really know how it relates. First and Second Maccabees is a accounting of the Maccabean revolt itself. Does anybody know why Hanukkah is celebrated? And Hanukkah means dedication. It's about the dedication of the temple. Why it's celebrated for 8 nights? We've got the oil.
Oh yeah, the desecration of the temple.
Okay, but so why do they celebrate for 8 nights? It's not the oil. What's that? Yeah, it wasn't that. Interestingly, so the answer is given to us in I want to say it's First Maccabees. Don't hold me to that. It's either at the beginning of First Maccabees or at the beginning of Second Maccabees. It starts off as a letter written to the Jews at Alexandria to let them know what has occurred and to talk to them about the great miraculous works that occur, how these Jews who literally are farmers and priests come to be able to defeat what at that time was one of the greatest armies of the world, and who keeps coming at them with greater numbers and greater forces and bringing battle elephants, and there's no way that they should have been able to do it, but they do. And what they want to do is have a because the dedication of the temple at the time of Solomon occurred during the Feast of Sukkot. How many days is the Feast of Sukkot? 7. Plus the great 8th day. So see, here's one of the things that even then, so God's really clear in his word. Sukkot is 7 days. He says that over and over and over again. And then there's a great 8th day. But it's not part of Sukkot. It's a different appointment than Sukkot itself, which is interesting. Remember, the yearly appointments all have to do with God's game plan for the salvation, first of the Jews, then of Israel as a whole in the fall, and then of the world, right? Sukkot, all of the sacrifices are not for the Jews, they're for the nations, right? God has a game plan, first fruits in the spring of a bigger harvest to come in the fall, right? But so they wanted to have a celebration that was similar because it was a dedication ceremony, and they viewed Sukkot as an 8-day festival. So even though it's a 7-day festival, but that's the specific reason that Hanukkah is 8 days. Interestingly, it's not about the oil, but the oil does come into play. We will talk about that next week as well. Questions? Where do we get our oil? Yep, it's olive oil.
It takes a long time to crush it.
Takes 8 days to prepare it, and in conjunction with the because it's not just oil that's lit. There's actually a certain set of spices and other things that they have to do to bring it all together. So. It is, yeah. It was, and they couldn't use it for other things. Just like the incense that was brought, and just like the anointing oil, they could not. It was made special. It was kept secret as to what the ingredients were, because what they didn't want was somebody to figure out what was in it and then to start marketing some sort of perfume outside of the temple. It was only for service to the God. It was set apart for God. So. Keith.
Yeah, I got a question
Uh-huh.
about the book of Maccabees.
Uh-huh.
When was it written, and is it considered a part of the canon of Scripture? Or
Depends on who you talk to. So, and I actually cover that next class. That'll be, so if you don't mind, I'd like to defer that. The short answer is there are some folks who absolutely consider it canonical. The Ethiopics, the Ethiopian Christians, the Greek Orthodox, there's a number of other groups that consider it canonical.
I've heard that there was this 400 years between Micah and Jesus.
We call it the quiet period. It was anything but.
But this was during that time, right?
Yes, it was. And so we'll talk about next time, when I put up the graphics for it, I think you'll start understanding that there's good reason for including it. There's good reasons for not including it. And we'll kind of talk about that. And we'll talk about why it is that the Jews don't include it. Well, you think, well, if anybody is going to include it, right? The Jews would include it, right? Well, they consider it a book of wisdom, but it doesn't raise to the level of being included within the Tanakh. So we'll talk about why that is next time. Another question? All right. Well, we will see you guys Tuesday next. And happy Hanukkah. You're welcome.